You'll know, and we're live! Yay!
You're only live once.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Okay. Okay, sir, who is Prime Minister?
Ami.
Okay, who is Eller?
Me.
Barish. Who is DPM? Who is DPM?
Ishak.
Chuck. Who is DLR?
Wasif.
Who is, okay, yeah. Oh yeah, Fardin or Ishak, who's Iron Manning?
পরে ডিসাইড করে বলতেছে
That's whatever. Okay, so without further ado, the motion is in the link below and in the YouTube stream and everywhere. Let's have the Prime Minister. Here.
Here.
Wait, starting at 12:10 a.m. Wow.
গাইস শোনা যায়
Yes, we can hear you. Let me get my timer ready. Wait. Yeah, I'm ready when you are.
দাও টাইমার অন করি হ্যাঁ 3 2 1 go. Ladies and gentlemen, in a world where your choice hides the future of your children, haunts the dreams of his mind, belittles him in the future in the face of society, and devastates his ability to perform according to his beliefs, is a world where side government would prefer not to live in. We bring to you 8 constructives from side government. Firstly, we're going to talk about how it was an informed choice on the part of the woman to have that baby and how it ends up being her liability. What do we mean by that? We meant that that person, when that woman chose to let that fetus go into a baby, when that person knows that at the end of the day, she's going to take that baby and bring it up in the future. Because clearly she's not aborting that baby. Clearly she's growing that fetus within herself. We think the implication is such that automatically when you make that informed decision, you have liability for that kid. And we think that you cannot ruin the future of that kid to begin with. Second constructive. Why do you think the state have a right to criminally hold that particular woman liable? We do interfere in certain cases within the parent-child relationship, right? For instance, if that particular individual, if that particular family has domestic abuse, we do go in and pursue criminal charges and whatnot. We do go in and social services does go in and take care for the child. The reason the state has an incentive and the state has a right is because the moment of time the child enters society, that's not only liable, he's not only liable, the old mother is not only the one who's liable, but the state as a whole is liable too. We need to ensure that children's interests are protected. First constructive. Why do we tell you that our model is different from abortion to begin? We think it's different from abortion because clearly we think that if the woman's mindset was such, we're going to talk from the woman's mindset for a minute here, right? If the woman's mindset was such that look, that fetus is not alive yet, and that it cannot feel, and that it is not a human being yet, and that it is an individual, according to the mindset, wanted to go in and commit abortion, we are fine with that, right? Because we clearly under that justification that fetus cannot feel yet, and we don't think that's wrong. What do we tell you distinctions from our side? We think that abortion is okay, but we're not willing to live with the current system because it means that your lifestyle choices have an impact on that particular child when he stops being a fetus and starts being a human being for the remainder of his life. The devastation of being mentally deformed and whatnot, the devastation of having cognitive learning disabilities, the devastation of not being able to perform on a similar level as your fellow peers, or having physical deformities and whatnot. The devastation is so extreme that you have to suffer for the remainder of your life. Clearly, it's a living example and a living individual who you're inflicting harm upon, and we think that's severely detrimental. Fourth constructive. Why do we think that we are never okay with an individual who has a liability committing heinous crimes, heinous acts such as this in a particular scenario? The reason why we are always principally opposed when Bashar al-Assad goes in and drops chemical weapons on his own citizens is because we feel that Bashar al-Assad never, regardless of whatever false mandate was given to him 30 or 40 years ago, never has the right to go in and commit that particular harm upon his own citizens. The reason why we're principally opposing is nuclear weapons. because we think that even if in a world where somehow it has some benefits, in the short term, we are never okay with that, because in the long term, the benefits that the children of those generations, that the individuals of those generations have to suffer for years on end, are in harms that we're never okay with. We clearly show you how
Information,
that's the exact
Fardin.
same type of harm that we clearly see under our model. There are four types of cases we think we are going to encounter under our model, encounter under the status quo. So moving on to the fifth constructive, right? First case being where the woman is going through a normal depression, right? Feels that she needs to cure her depression by going in and smoking or drinking alcohol. We think that even if she feels the need to go in and cure her depression, the depression is a structure that was created for that structure that's much less important when we think about the long-term repercussions that the child has to face. We think it's principally justified even if she's going through depression, and this is the most convenient case for child opposition. We think even if she's going through that depression, we have a principle to hold her accountable for the actions that she goes through because of the long-term implications of the child and the fellow human being that she's damaging. Second case that we think might come up, right? Where it's not a normal depression, where it's mad depression, right? Where it's insanity. We think under our model, we do have exclusions, that those cases are specifically exclusive cases, right? And not cases that we can deal with too. Because we think that in cases of insanity, generally, there are always exceptions in most criminal cases, and that can happen under our model too. If you characterize this individuals as the most insane of women, we think we can take that into account too. Third scenario we think we might encounter, right? Where that individual might have been forced, that individual was probably raped, and because of religious reasons cannot go in and commit that abortion, right? We think that we deal with that particular scenario too. Understand this, that if that particular scenario is such, where you're not allowed to abort and you go in and commit that particular lifestyle choice because you're in depression due to that forced choice, or because maybe you were raped, we think that we account for that. How so? Because under our model, just because we're holding that woman criminally liable does not mean that we cannot hold that individual who commits the rape as an accessory too. We think under our model, because in an accessory to the crime that is being committed, we can hold that individual accountable too. That individual that commits that rape to begin with. We tell you under our scenario that not only should this woman be held criminally liable in these cases where the rape and religion comes into account, but that individual who commits that particular rape also can be taken into account. We take that case in our model, and we think that can be catered to under our model. So we clearly should see why we cater to those individuals too. The last case, why we cater to these individuals too. But then lastly, what we tell you, we think that we have a principle that stands from our side, a principle where you as an individual commit long-term damages to a child who you essentially have liability to. We think that in a lot of cases, firstly, that you as an individual made an informed choice to be liable for that particular children, right? Secondly, what do we show you? We show you that the state has a right to go in and intervene in the parent-child relationship that we talk about. Thirdly, we talk about how this is not different from abortion in the case, because abortion is about a non-living entity, and how our case is about a living entity which has to suffer the damages for probably the huge whole extent of his lifetime. Firstly, we talk about the impacts on these individuals. We characterize these impacts. We talk about the long-term impacts, the cognitive learning disabilities, where you're constantly marginalized by society due to your deformities, and how that's so bad. We talk about three cases where we cater to most individuals. Firstly, the common individual who goes in and just wants to cure her depression. We cater to that. We cater to cases of insanity. But most importantly, we also cater to cases of where rapists and religions come into account. We deter those rapists from committing that particular crime to begin with. We deter those individuals from going in and hurting those particular children to begin with. Women under their model, even if they're suffering from normal depression, understand that their children's interests need to be taken into account much better. Those rapists start raping much less. But more importantly, we show you why we protect their children. This debate is clearly not about abortion. This debate is about the family where these individuals are harmed in the long term. We cater to these individuals. Wasif bhai stopped asking POIs after I moved on my fifth constructive. Clearly we win this debate. Thank you.
Here. I thank the Prime Minister for his speech and welcome the Leader of Opposition, Warish. Here. Warish.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. As much as they would like it to be, this isn't a debate about a baby. This isn't a debate about a children. It's not a debate about the offspring. What this debate is about those first 4 months of the pregnancy. It's about those months when that fetus exists in the woman. It is not about causing future harm to that child. We, on our time opposition, do stand okay with punishing harm to children. What we do not support is holding a woman criminally liable, something that they fail to clarify from their side, for causing harm to a fetus which is a non-entity in itself, which isn't a legal entity with moral rights. We tell you that they don't show you why they override the autonomy of the woman, and they don't justify on the very basic principle of their case why we need to punish harms to an individual who doesn't exist. We'll show this to you under 2 constructives. First, why that fetus is not a moral entity in itself. 2, why they have full autonomy, and therefore the conclusion from this shows that you cannot show future harm as a legitimate factor in your moral calculus. First, the three rebuttals towards their case. First, they tell us that the woman knows the consequences, not taken. So they know the consequences, and they would like you to say that not aborting means you take on a godly responsibility and that you take all the responsibility of what happens afterwards. What they fail to realize is that in the vast majority of cases, these women who go into these lifestyle choices such as smoking and drinking, these people at the worst of case, these people who don't have access to safe legal abortion. These are women who don't have access to the health care that they deserve. So in their case, they push upon these women an extra burden that they didn't ask for. They push upon these women who are already suffering yet an even greater burden of having to be criminally liable, of being held as a criminal, as an unethical person, as someone who is in the worst case of society, not taken. So on their case, they push this upon the women who don't have access to these safe abortions in the first place. Second, they tell us a very interesting point where they tell us that abortion is okay, but harming the future kid isn't. Here's a crucial justification. They fail to justify why that individual being harmed is one that doesn't exist, and therefore their needs are something that we have to cater for. They need to justify from their case, including the consideration of harm to non-existent individuals. That's something they fail to do in their 8 so-called constructives. Not taken. Third, they tell us about the case of rape victims. This is where they absolutely lose the debate from the very first speech. When they tell us that they would punish a rape victim, and it's okay because the rapist is also punished. We see it as a principally abhorrent thing to do. We see it as something that they simply cannot stand for from their side or from any side with any sort of basis of human understanding. Because they need to understand the circumstance of the conception itself in these rape cases is one that harmed the fetus. Because the intense stress of being a rape victim is one that harms that fetus in this case. So they need to justify punishing the rape victim in this case. But before I move on, a POI from Fardin.
Understand that the rapist, that the person who got raped could go in and commit that abortion to begin with, right? However, she didn't choose to do so. We cater to those scenarios where she didn't choose to do so, and we show you how we even remove incentives for individuals to not go in and commit those rapes, because we talk about those scenarios where they didn't choose to abort, even though they could have done so. Respond.
Here's the thing. When the moral considerations follow from it, when you have an individual that's being harmed, in this case, there isn't an individual or a legal entity that is harmed. Therefore, the harms from this case do not follow to the point where you get a criminally liable case. First constructive today, we'll show you why we're talking about a fetus that isn't a legal entity. We talk to you about, in this case, the harm is done to the fetus in itself, and this isn't not taken. Then we tell you that in this case, the fetus isn't a legal entity with moral rights, and therefore it isn't criminally okay to hold that woman liable. First of all, because the fetus in itself isn't self-aware, it isn't conscious, therefore it doesn't afford human rights that we afford to others. On a secondary basis, it can't feel pain, it can't suffer, so we don't afford it the level of rights that we give to animals. On a third and final basis, it doesn't have general interests or wants or desires, which is the very point of a right to protect in the first place. So it doesn't have general rights in that sense. Therefore, this fetus itself is not a legal entity. And in this case, when the fetus is being harmed, you aren't harming someone with rights, you aren't harming someone in at all, you're harming a part of the woman's body. Given that this a woman has full autonomy of her own body, and this fetus at that point is a part of herself, it's not able to survive independently, and biologically it's still attached deeply to that woman. This harm is considered of self-harm, which we see is perfectly legitimate, as that woman fully owns and has control over her own body and every single part of her own body in that case. So what do we show you from that constructive is that you don't have a criminal liable factor. The only thing that they can have is trying to attempt to bring in future harms. The second constructive shows you why future harm itself is not a legitimate factor to bring in. First, understand that at the point of conception, when the sperm meets the egg, that little cell doesn't have rights. Nor does it gain rights when it's 2 cells or 4 cells or 8 cells. When does this individual gain a right? When is an individual created? It's created when they can form an identity, when they're capable of feeling pain, when they're capable of being conscious, which is at the moment of birth. Given that at the moment of birth doesn't happen yet, it hasn't happened, you're still in the 4th month of pregnancy, that future harm can't be considered in this case. Understand the consequence of taking the principle where you take in any sort of future harm as a harm in your criminal case. Under that case, understand what happens if you as a family, instead of having 2 children, you decide to have 1. You prevent an individual who otherwise would have existed from existing. This is analogous to their case, and in their case, you apply their principle, what you get is murder. You prevented one individual, not taken, Zahin. So you prevented an individual from existing when they otherwise wouldn't have. Understand that in this case, it's not your responsibility to bring about the best possible world that could ever exist, because no matter what you do, there will eventually be harms of one from another. But in this case, that individual being harmed doesn't exist. In this case, the individual being harmed isn't born yet in the very first place. So when you have their principle not standing, when you can't include future harms to a non-existent entity as part of your calculus in a court, because that's something that you can't practically implement in the court system, that you cannot practically implement in any moral system in the first place, because those individuals, to have an infringement of their rights, they have to exist in the first place. Just because they may exist in the future doesn't mean you consider their rights in the present status quo. Second, we tell you, as an extension of this argument itself, even if you do consider future harms, why is it still harmful under their world? Because their punishment harms even more, and it harms, more importantly, the individuals with rights who currently exist. Namely, what do? They separate an entire family. They bring about the entire stress of being in a court, of going through an intense psychological and mental and financial stress, which destroys an entire household, which destroys an entire family, which prevents that child, which would have been born, from having the childhood that they deserve. It prevents them from having this creates a real and tangible harm to those people. And the worst harm that they have on their side is where, even if she didn't intend to, through forced or circumstances of putting them into that situation, these criminal cases paint that mother with having malicious intent to harm. That this destroys their family dynamic. This destroys any hope of having a healthy childhood, of having a healthy relationship with your parents in the first place. Understand that from their side, they have a punishment that doesn't work. They have a punishment that they fail to justify because it harms people who don't exist yet. We tell you that we respect autonomy, we respect women's rights, and therefore we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Can I just start?
Hey, Ishak bhai,
হ্যাঁ
কি whip দিবা?
কি কেন তুমি দিতে পারবে না?
হ্যাঁ,
Can you like not whip?
প্যারা দিচ্ছ।
প্যারা।
Like it's 12:30 and I'm a class 9 kid.
Dude, you wanted to whip.
না, হ্যাঁ, but like I
No,
wanted to
worries.
give one speech, but like এখন তো
That's a fine, we'll see. If you can stay up, please stay up. I don't like whipping. Acha, can I just start?
Yeah, sure.
Alright then, 3, 2, 1, go. Side opposition assumes that we're talking about people who have the choice of going into abortion. We're not, okay? Firstly, because we're simply talking about women who choose to have the baby. This debate is limited to that, and is limited to that for various reasons, which I'll outline. I also want you to believe that this debate is like about women's rights or like bodily autonomy. It isn't. This debate isn't about a woman's rights or individual autonomy. This is about parenting rights. The simple analogy to show this is that. If you say you have domestic abuse in your own household, then the state comes in and takes your kid away and puts him into a foster home. Why? Because they want to prevent the future harms that will come to that kid by being in your abusive domestic house. Warish tries and give you some shitty analogy about how, like, this by putting them through court, this puts them in like through further harms and stuff. No, that's simply not true. If you come from a shitty family, chances are domestic abuse happens under your roof, and that's a shitty lifestyle to a kid, anyways. So we don't really see what kind of a flip side they're trying to show there. Warish wants to like sort of end the debate by telling you that, oh look, a fetus doesn't have legislative rights, so no, we can't do this at all. Look, no shit, Sherlock. If that was really the case, we wouldn't be debating here in the first place. This debate is entirely more or less contingent upon potential future harms, either to the woman or to the child, and that's exactly what we're debating about. Your side is debating as to whether or not this will like push further burden upon the woman, to which like she will have to suffer for the future years, or what this puts further burden upon the child, which will live for the further years. Don't try and scapegoat this. We are absolutely abhorred by what Warish is trying to say here. Right. So the first question that comes up from their side, burden responsibility. Fardin already tells you that the moment that woman decides to not have an abortion, that's when she's saying by her own right and own choice that yes, I'm going to carry this child to term. I want him to have a healthy childhood and everything of that sort. We do as a state, even if we don't assume, like, worst case scenario, even if we don't assume that parenting gives you some sort of like this god-given right to like take care of your children, we still assume that children deserve an innocent childhood, that children deserve a well childhood. This is why we have social services. This is why we do have orphanages. This is why we do take away children from broken families and put them into orphanages systems or under like social services, things like that, because we do assume that childhood in itself is like this one thing that should be morally preserved and should be like children should be taken care of, right? So under that consensus, Fardin tells you why the state has a right to impose this, because the moment that woman chooses, like at worst case scenario, if it's the woman herself who actively chooses for no like potentially great external reason to like go into a lifestyle of smoking and alcohol, then it is essentially her fault why that child has now got cognitive disabilities, why that child is probably much more retarded than his peers, why that child probably has physical disabilities which prevents him from playing sports and socially interacting and even just going out with friends, etc., etc. We think that this severely lowers the quality of livelihood for the child, and that at the slightest of extent, the mother should be held responsible. Fardin goes one step further and tells you that if it's an exclusive case where there is, say, an influence of a third party, say abusive husband or a rapist or something, then because we hold criminal charges here, we can further extend those criminal charges onto the actual perpetrator at hand, be it the abusive husband or like the rapist. The simple analogy here is, consider this. If a murderer murders a woman versus murdering a pregnant woman, which one gets the longer sentence? The latter. Because we do believe that on some level, harming a pregnant woman, a woman who wants to give that child an identity, who wants to see that child grow up into the world, that's a larger crime, right? And if opposition really wants an answer as to whether or not the fetus has identity, we tell you this. If a woman wants that fetus to have an identity, then it's fine by us. That's an exercise of bodily autonomy. You're telling me that a part of your body is eventually going to be a person one day. We think that's perfectly fine, right? If they really want to rebut us, they need to engage with us on that one matter, and then maybe some of Warsh's speech makes any sense at all. So, moving on to my second idea, right? As to why exactly these burdens will eventually lead to deterrence, which in turn helps the situations that these women are consequently in, right? We tell you that the moment that a state imposes a certain burden, like especially it's something like a criminal charge, there's got to be good reasons for it, right? We already show you those reasons. We tell you that the harms far outweigh any sort of potential pleasure or mitigation of depression that the woman might go through. The reason why Fardin speaks specifically about depression is that, yeah, sure, perhaps the woman needs to drink alcohol to forget her sorrows in one day. but that moment of drinking alcohol doesn't mitigate her depression as much as it causes harms to the child who potentially won't have a good childhood to begin with. It eventually results in the child undergoing like much larger harms, simply like say due to the butterfly effect. And that's why we think that the harms of the child outweigh any rights to the woman. So why exactly is there a factor of deterrence here? We tell you if it's criminally liable, it provides deterrence to the woman. It means that women will think twice before drinking alcohol or smoking a cigarette. Why is that important? Firstly, of course, the woman herself, she becomes more bodily aware, more aware about health and things like that, about taking care of herself. Secondarily, she sets a role model for other women who may be in hard situations and may want to take up smoking and alcohol. And by the way, here's the thing. If you are depressed and you are in a shitty position in life, you don't have to smoke, you don't have to drink alcohol. You can go to a therapist, get medication, etc., etc. It's not they're not completely out of choices, right? So why we think it's very important that we bring those women into the right path, right? A much more healthier path. And we think that's perfectly possible. So no, we're not condemning depressed people altogether. I think it's important that these women follow by this deterrence, because then they end up setting role models for other potential mothers, and they can use their examples to realize that, look, you might be in a shitty domestic situation. You might be burdened with a child that you may perhaps not internally want, but due to like religious values, at the worst of scenarios, have to keep. We tell you that there will be examples set for a way out of this. Thirdly, we think, and this is somewhat nuanced, so please pay attention here. If, say, you have an abusive husband or something, suddenly he needs to now think before he hits you when you're pregnant. He now needs to think about whether or not the harms that he causes to that child will eventually be factored onto him as well. Because the moment we tell you that these criminal charges can be also considered on an accessory level, that this husband can eventually be resulted as an accessory to the criminal charge that the woman gets, we tell you that we make him accountable as well. And this is especially important given the fact that in the majority of domestic abuse cases, the woman is the one that is underspoken. The woman is the one that is usually left shut up by, say, the husband due to like internalized misogyny and patriarchy, things of that nature, right? So we tell you that that's very important, and this is like a second level of deterrence. It provides protection for the pregnant woman on an overall basis. So at the end of the day, we think that at the very least, our model covers up all of these potential cases, as Fardin clearly details to you, and I like further extend on. And on the overall of it, we can tell you that at the end of the day, our model does help certain individuals. If our 7 minutes, sorry. If our model can show to improve the life of at least one woman and one child over the course of the future, then we tell you that we at the very least win this debate by marginal benefits. Wasif needs to come up and tell you why exactly it is perhaps not legitimate to consider future burdens when we clearly show to you even their case relies on future burdens on some level. Wasif needs to come up and tell you why the harms of the child do not outweigh the harms that the mother has to go through. Wasif needs to tell you why our deterrence doesn't work. And if he can successfully do that, maybe he has some shot. But till now, they haven't got zills because they haven't engaged on any one of our conditions. To reiterate, we've shown you why society already has certain measures of protecting children, why children are like on some level a state interest as well as an individual interest. We show you why the mother does become liable the moment she decides to keep that child, not only to herself as a parent, but also to the state in bringing up that child. Think about it. If the child has to go through social services, then the state is paying for that. Taxes pay for that. We've also shown you how the informed choice mechanism works. We've also shown you how deterrence works through our multiple layers and given her a model and extending to the layer of bringing accessories, why that brings on extra deterrence. And for all of these reasons, we think our model is concrete and we're very proud to propose. 8 minutes, 30 seconds.
Yeah. Here. I thank the DPM for his speech and welcome the DLer, Wasif.
Yeah, give me like 10 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Wait, where's Sarah?
She left.
Oh, guys, শোনা যায়? Oh, guys.
We can
হ্যাঁ, speech দিতে পারবো না, শুনতে পারবো. Check the chat.
You're whipping.
Can you whip? Please whip.
Check the chat দেখো.
Guys, I'm starting in like 5 seconds.
Guys, chat দেখো.
Do I have to whip speech?
Wait, কোন chat? Facebook chat নাকি Google chat?
Arey, hangout speech. He wants me to whip, dude.
Right, Guys, I'm starting the
Can
speech.
I like not whip?
Just whip.
I don't want to whip.
Oh
And
God.
Sakib can't speak.
Sakib doesn't have to speak. 2v2.
I can speak.
Why? How can you speak if there's no speech before you?
Shut up, Sakib.
Just give your speech. Whoever it is.
Alright, I'm starting the speech then.
What's it?
On 3, 2, 1, go. If the major benefit from side proposition's case is to somehow bring about two levels of deterrence, we think it's by far the worst possible case they could try to opt for today. We think a few characterizations are important and this has to be made primarily. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that when you as a woman would consent to have a child, we think at the very least you wouldn't be absolutely irrational and with no interest of that child would harm that particular fetus at that point in time because you have the intention of giving birth to a child at that point in time. We think provided that characterization is universally true and in majority of cases exists, the only reason when you do actively harm that child due to lifestyle choices would probably because of circumstances you could not control otherwise. In those circumstances, like Fardin points out, structural reasons leading to depression and inability to access services of healthcare are actively things which makes your life hell even when you are not forced to be pregnant with this child, even when you're not forced to bear this child and bear all the consequences of pregnancy, ladies and gentlemen. In that circumstance, when the state is possibly the agent to blame, you go on and blame this disenfranchised woman further and put them into a worse position by tainting
POI.
them as criminals. No, in that circumstance, we think, ladies and gentlemen, in these circumstances when you could not control your actions, your lifestyle choice is going to be given greater priority than the life of that particular fetus, which is a non-being at that point in time. Primarily, ladies and gentlemen, we think this characterization is quite important. Secondly, we think in case of abuse, the fact that you're also punishing the rapist is absolutely irrelevant here, because our goal isn't to make sure that most punishment is dealt. Our goal is to ensure that both that future child in this circumstance and that woman is best served. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, at that point in time, it's absolutely abhorrent that you would choose to blame someone who had absolutely no control over any of the factors determining the future position of her life. If you have been raped, if you're forced to carry this child, we think the fact that you want to drink a glass of alcohol to soothe some of the pain is a perfectly legitimate lifestyle choice, because in that circumstance your life was otherwise the worst hell you could imagine it to be. On further rebuttal, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the argument of deterrence is quite vague in this case and doesn't necessarily have much merit, primarily because when a woman does choose to harm that child, we think that at that point in time, knowing that the spirit of knowledge exists, when you do harm the child, we think you have a direct sense of irrationality at that point in time. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if you had the ability to think twice, you would think twice even before harming that child to begin with, provided you would give birth to that child. We see no incentive to harm
Wasif.
that child and an active incentive to not. We think the very sense of parenthood is a biological development when you're pregnant, but b, a moral development you have as well. In that circumstance, we think the fact that you do go on and harm the child is that you cannot control what you're about to do in that circumstance, ladies and gentlemen. We think deterrence is only applicable when you can make an objective, rational choice, and you're less likely to make that choice in this scenario.
Wasif.
Secondly,
POI.
ladies and gentlemen, no, we think that yes, their only idea is that this is one of the options to go on and soothe your pain. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that constructive solutions are probably not the things you seek when you're in this much pain. In most cases, you first need to numb that pain and then you can go for constructive solutions. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's unfair just because that short-term lapse of your rationality to give this individual punishment for whatever happens to that entity which may be born in the future. We think in
Wasif.
that
POI.
circumstance, deterrence no isn't a legitimate benefit we obtain in this case. But furthermore, the argument of role models is quite stupid, because in majority of circumstances, you don't see women actively harming their children, and those role models exist even in status quo, which means punishment won't necessarily make a major benefit. But furthermore, the final argument is just the most absurd one: the fact that you need to punish guys because of less reporting, that you should also punish the women so that they're both included in that circumstance to create some version of deterrence. We think if that feeling of guilt, if that feeling of fear existed, the current law enforcement system would very well do enough to make that guy not abuse your woman, which is also illegal, equally criminally punishable. We think, ladies and gentlemen, in that circumstance doesn't add any additional value. Any points, Zahin?
Are you okay with, say, carbon emissions, which allow short-term development but devastates the lives of millions due to climate change in the long term? This analogy is very similar to what you're allowing. The child could be hurt for eternity to protect one stupid lifestyle choice.
Number one, we think the gravity is significantly in question. Number two, the probability of harm is significantly in question. Number three, in that circumstance, we think that this particular effect on each and every individual is quite minimal in case of carbon emissions, and in the aggregate effect is what matters greater. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we think in this case you don't have to go on and make carbon emissions because you're irrational, abused, and have no other alternatives. In this case, that's exactly what's happening. So a criminal punishment is extremely abhorrent. We think it's not good that you may make choices that may harm you. However, criminal punishment is just too big a version of punishment that you give to this individual, which is why, ladies and gentlemen, the harms are much greater, principally proving why it's extremely abhorrent that you used to hold this person criminally liable just because of this one lifestyle choice, which may be the only thing which heals this individual in such great extent of pain. The second constructive being, provided that this is principally unjustified, we think that this particular action of criminal liability further worsens the debate even in proposition side, where you consider these people as entities. This is on few levels. Waresh touched this. Primarily, ladies and gentlemen, we think that the second you are subject to a criminal case, you are an individual who is considered someone who had direct malicious intent to harm someone. In that circumstance, ladies and gentlemen, you permanently tag this woman or the mother of that child as someone who wanted to harm them, potentially breaking down any development of the sacred relationship between the child and this parent for the future development of that child. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that particular tagline makes it extremely difficult for that child to have one of their parents in their life. We think in that circumstance, you even hurt the child. Let's just forget about the extent to which you hurt the parent in this circumstance. Secondly, the possibility of criminal liability leads to a number of harms in different circumstances. They have not clarified what punishment this may be. If it's in the case of separation, we think you make this child void of one parent, even in the case when you do possibly need that parent in their growth, because as they point out, the nurturing of these children is extremely crucial. States use their own resources to do this. Under your model, you not only provide them state resources to take care of themselves, you also take away that particular affection of one of the parents who could have possibly atoned for one of the mistakes they had made in the past. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, you choose to raise up this child who is born with disabilities in their case without one of the parents. It's particularly difficult when you're born with disabilities and you need a greater amount of affection and a greater amount of emotion in your life, and not hatred towards the individual who is expected to be closest to you throughout your life. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that is a circumstance that worsens that particular impact on children, parents, and that family in general, possibly leading to the probability of the family not being able to sustain itself. Opposition is proud in this debate to oppose, because we clearly showed you why the punishment is significantly unfair, and that the harms of the punishment on the woman is extreme, provided that a few lifestyle choices in situations of compulsion are not big enough for you to go through criminal liability. And why in the future, even in terms of an impact level analysis, we think it hurts the child, it hurts that particular woman. We're very proud to oppose.
Alright, can I start?
Can you wait like 10 seconds? Let me just go get some water.
I don't want to wait 10 seconds.
Dude, come on.
I'm gonna lose this anyways, lucky. Just kidding, I'm not gonna lose this. I hope not.
Guys, am I of any more use here, or can I leave?
Acha, yeah, start.
Alright then, 3, 2, 1, start. WhatsApp gives you a very specific and very particular case as a sort of example as to why our model might not work. I'm going to show you why. A, it doesn't even matter if it doesn't work, because to quote him, it's very particular, it's very exclusive. Secondarily, it does work, right? They say that what if in the case that this thing does go through, it goes through courts and it goes like in the way of separation. Well, in that scenario, Are you really trying to tell me that all single parents in the world, even like those who are given the full support of the community around them, the full support of social services and what they have to offer, things like, all the way from affirmative action to quotas in school to special like learn extra classes in school, etc., etc., they don't have the like ability to be much more equitable in terms of like being equal to their peers, so on and so forth. The very reason well, the states already do this. It's two things. Firstly, they believe that it's a right for these children to grow up. So we're not really sure where you went on with that, because Wasit never really gave a conclusion to that as to what happens if. It never says like what their side wants from this debate. Would you rather that that child was not born at all? Would you rather that that child be born anyways and no one be held liable for the actions that have been brought upon the child, or something else? He never answers you that. But what we can tell you is that the state already believes in it. There's already evidence to support that. But furthermore, what we can tell you even more is that we think it's like we think it's okay to make those harms be criminally liable. Like say, perhaps if it's the case of an abusive father, or like if it's a separation in family, you can always blame one person or the other. That's what divorce lawyers are good at figuring out, right? So we think that that can bring about parties who are willing to like give support and pay for it, and we make them accountable, all right, liable for it. Just because it has the word criminal in it doesn't automatically assume it's bad. So secondarily, we tell you that they try and tell us that is it worse if, like say, if say these kids they go through the harms of like being in a court system, knowing that their mother has been criminally charged, so on and so forth, versus them living in the household that they are. Two things to that. First and foremost, extremely underanalyzed, especially when like I come up in my second speech, and as well as Fardin tells you that we'll have that layer of accessory to crime to our model, which tells you one thing, that these courts are going to check whether the crimes are entirely contingent upon the woman's actions. They tell you that the courts are going to check who's really liable for this. The only thing that we're implementing is that there will be liabilities in accordance to like harms given to the fetus, which is actually our principle from the get-go to this debate, which was not contested in Moss's speech, which was only ever contested in Warish's speech by a wrong assumption, a vague assumption that all fetuses cannot have legal rights whatsoever, even when the mother decides it as a part of her autonomous body to give it rights. Absolute bullshit. So, overlooking our principle, he does not tackle us at our hardest. Rather, he chooses to nitpick, and we tell you why the nitpicking doesn't work either, right? So, furthermore,
Point of information.
sure.
So provided that you successfully punish this parent, and provided that there is a very minimal chance of deterrence, is it a good enough punishment, or is it worth it to take this parent away or taint them as a criminal to that child for the future
Sure. I'll
development of
get
that
onto
child?
the deterrence part in a bit. All right. Just because someone is a tagline to criminal, we don't think we live in 1982 or something anymore, where everyone tagline to criminal is like stigmatized upon it. We think we've come on from that, especially when we've already decriminalized drugs in a lot of countries. We don't consider pot smokers to be all bad or anything, so we don't really see what kind of analogy you're trying to drag out from that. But I'll get onto the main crux of that into explaining one of my clashes. But before that, one last argument that I like to point out. How exactly does the court check this? And this is somewhat of an extension, right? Warish tries to tell you something interesting, that if you do make them criminally liable, the family has to go through the burdens of going through court, the giving witness statements, so on and so forth. The converse to that is that the families live in their abusive households and continue enacting undergoing the harms anyways, right? Why is it that we think that even if a court is like a very uncomfortable place to be in, it's still alright? Because there you have people supporting you. You have an entire panel of defendants, of your family members, your close relatives, there to give you witness statements and support you. You think that that's perfectly fine. It tells you that in a misogynistic world, where your husband's right hand, bloody right hand, is the only thing that controls you, we think it's perfectly fine for the woman and the child to realize the world is probably not as nice a place, and that at the same time there are guardians who are willing to help you. We think that's one analysis we look at. The secondary analysis is, people nowadays are much more socially aware. They're aware of when things like rape happen, that it could be a two-sided story. Why is that? It's because we've seen throughout the years, especially things like media reporting and whatnot, we've gone up exponentially in the amount of information we have regarding, say, domestic abuse and things of that nature. What has that actively done? It has actively shunned people away from having unprotected sex. It's told people that you should wear condoms, you should have better family planning, right? We think that this is some sort of a similar thing that goes around here. If you have people who are being criminally liable for these all the reasons that we provide you, not taken, you've had your shot, then we can tell you that the similar idea works out under our model. People have become much more socially aware about the harms that can come about of like bringing up a child within these conditions. And no, that isn't to say that we're pro-life or anything, so don't try and jab that onto us. We're simply telling you
Sir?
that if you choose to take on, not taken, if you choose to take on the burden of a mother, you have to consider these things because that child life matters not only to the mother but to the rest of society. That being said, they, that basically proves how social awareness does come about. People will read about it, people will share it on Facebook, make it go viral, people will talk about it, teenage girls will start talking about it, and so on. We think that we can like get this sort of an ideology fixated into society, and it will perhaps even become normalized in the years to come.
Information?
Taken. So moving on to
Right.
clashes.
Ah, so not taken, my bad.
So, first clash, the justification of this choice, is it really justified to put a person through all this burden? Side opposition tries to tell you, tries to prove that this justification isn't legitimate by telling you that it's about bodily autonomy. We tell you that's absolutely false. This debate isn't about bodily autonomy, rather it's about parenting. We provide you analogies where the state have enacted laws where there was a case of like misconduct of parenting happening and domestic abuse, and the future problems of the child were taken into consideration when enacting those laws, as well as executing them. Right? In cases of domestic abuse, children's being thrown.
Ishraq point.
For example, not taken 7 minutes. So we tell you that in these scenarios, the status quo already provides some justification for us against opposition's contention. But furthermore, we tell you that the justification is a bit more important than that because of reasons we are yet to see, because of things that we often don't take into consideration, because of the fact that motherhood is probably more important than you think, not to yourself, but to like the state as a whole. We think it's important that the mother realizes what the burden of having a child really means. And we think that for that reason alone, we can like criminally charge mothers who actively take on the lifestyle. And just to clarify, it was never really our burden to prove to you what kind of criminal charges we're giving. This motion is a principal debate in itself. But furthermore, we already show you examples of how these criminal charges can be lenient and can be shifted from one entity to the other depending on the severity, depending on the environment. So we're not really sure why they want to question that at all. Anyways, as I was saying, so we show you why there's justification for these criminal charges to begin with. Secondary clash is that does this at all improve the child's life? The situations in question being that in the situation where the child grows up, perhaps with certain disabilities, we tell you that for those disabilities, there are like affirmative actions and like social structures that are willing to help them, as well as growing up knowing that your mother is a criminal. We think that there are people in the world who grow up knowing that their parents are druggies, that their parents are whores. We're not really sure why is this case any more exclusive than that, right? Things that have been labeled as crimes by the society in the past, which are no longer really considered crimes. So we think that that analogy was there to prove you why our side is perfectly okay. Conversely, their side takes on a very conservative method, which is somewhat discriminatory to some extent because that puts opposition in the shoes of having to like justify themselves as to why they're okay by saying that disabled children don't deserve to live a fulfilling life. It puts them on the side that has to justify why it's okay to not hold liability to those who have made those children disabled, so on and so forth. And we think that we win that clash out as well. So overall, we showed to you why none of opposition's arguments stand, and we clearly take this debate. Thank you. 8 minutes 40.
Here. I think the government whip, and welcome the opposition whip to end the debate. Here.
Acha, before I start, could you all hear Ishraq's speech very clearly? Like, আমারটা অনেক hazy
No,
আসছে.
it was a little broken.
It was clear, but I got most of it.
It was kind of
I
unclear.
got it, but it wasn't
Really?
clear, yeah.
Yeah, ঠিক আছে. Like, I thought my internet connection was fucking up. তাহলে আমারটা ঠিক আছে. Can you hear me clearly?
We
Yeah.
can
Hear
hear
me? Pastor, wait, can I tell something? Can you guys hear me when I'm talking like this? Or is it breaking up?
No,
If you talk fast, we
breaking.
can't hear you. If you talk fast, we can.
Okay. How about this? Can you
No,
guys
it's
hear
broken.
me talking now?
Acha, it's
If-
irrelevant anyway now. So, Ishraq, like,
It's relevant for the next time I debate.
what?
It's relevant for the next time
Wait,
that I
the
debate.
faster he talks, the harder it is to understand what he's saying. Because it breaks apart, mid-syllable.
Oh, fuck. Dude.
আচ্ছা, তাহলে একটু সবাই মিউট করে আমি স্টার্ট করি। ঠিক আছে?
Sure. Go Sakib. Corporate teaming.
আচ্ছা। So, Team Government had a very contradictory stance on when do we hold people criminally liable or like whether or not a child is a moral, fetus is a moral entity or whatnot, right? So this debate took place for two sorts of mothers. First is the mother that chose to keep her child despite whatever happened to her. Perhaps it was not consented pregnancy, example rapes, example abuse or whatnot. But secondly, the type of people it was about two sorts of mother. First, the type who chose to abort their child, or the other type which chose to not abort their child, right? So for the people who did not choose to abort their child, they come up for the people who do not choose to abort their child, right? They come up and say that, you see, when you actually choose to keep your child, you give it some sort of morality, and hence you're accountable to protect it, right? What you need to understand at this point in time is that at this point in time there are various factors that affect this type of person, right? Like for instance, in the very first place, right? If you actually let's consider a case of normal people, right? When do you actually harm a child? Nobody actively chooses to harm a child. So if you do indeed end up harming a child intentionally, that means that you either did not want to have that child to begin with, or you are having that child forcibly. But secondly, it implies that that mother has like does not consider that child that sort of a moral entity, or moral entity enough to actually consider its bodily autonomy, right? So at this point in time, where team government bases the entire concept of the status of a child having a moral entity on the mother's perception of it, right? It's entirely dependent on the mother, and at that point in time, when a mother chooses to harm it, it inherently shows that the mother does not care about it, right? So hence their entire assumption falls flat. But secondly, they come up and tell us that, you see, we want, for people who are having this child because these are they have been raped, or or there are other social factors that are the stigma associated with having a child and whatnot, right? We want to make an example out of it, right? But if this is inherently immoral to make a woman suffer because of what society is inflicting on her, at the first point you need to understand the victim's mentality. Why? Because at the end of the day, this victim is the one who is suffering. At this point in time, if she's undergoing severe depression, right, that is affecting the child as well. So at the end of the day, when she goes on to say, go ahead and smoke some puffs of cigarette, or go ahead and drink, right? At the end of the day, she needs it to actually to rehabilitate herself, or to get out of that situation, that mental block that she is in right now. So we consider it completely legitimate to do so at that point in time. If you want rape victims to not get out of that shell, right, at the end of the day, you can never expect them to become good parents or to become responsible parents, right? At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, these are undue burdens that you put upon these people who are already suffering. At the end of the day, we do not support it. But thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the type of accountability that they talk about, right? Firstly, what you need to understand, that holding an accessory of crime accountable is something that is existent under our model as well, right? If you are a abusive husband, you're criminally you're equally punishable under law. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, if you are going to have enough surveillance to see which child is born due to these sorts of callousness in terms of parents, you can also have enough surveillance to see which sort of pregnant women are being abused by their partners, right? These are not interrelated, or you can have this surveillance anyway, and you can hold them morally culpable anyway, right? These are not interdependent on having this woman accountable. But what does this lead to, right? Let's talk about the alternative. Let's talk about the after effects of passing this bill. This leads to this child have a child who is morally disabled, right? A child who who has severe disabilities, right? A child who needs his parent support most, right? At this point in time, what they assume in itself is that the child is born into an abusive family, and at the end of the day will not get proper attention, right? What you need to understand is three sorts of things. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, even if not every woman who decides to have a child, who decides to not undergo abortion, even if she doesn't like the child, is from an abusive family. So hence, ladies and gentlemen, that child could have a safe childhood with that parent who actually would have taken care of him. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, even if that parent did it out of impulse or whatever, right? That momentary lapse of judgment, right? At the end of the day, that parent could come up, and that parent was the best actor in terms of guiding the child, in terms of taking care of that child, right? And at the end of the day, social services and state and whatever you whatever you name it, right, ladies and gentlemen, will not be able to give that sort of a care to that child that a parent could have given, right? So you're depriving that child who needs that care most, from that care just because you have an imaginary standard of that child being a moral entity and an imaginary standard of when a woman can like inflict self-harm, right? But like, but ladies and gentlemen, like when so like we believe that nobody would actively choose to affect nobody would actively choose to harm their children. So when is so which they come up and say that you see like when you keep and when you choose not to abort you are inherently you're morally accountable for it. So which picture is more believable, right? To understand this, right, there are people who do not have access to medical facilities. There are people who do not have access to abortion, right? For all these sorts of people, they have been like they're undergoing severe stress. They might or might not be like they might be susceptible to societal stigma. B, but they might have been raped as well. So they are victims of social oppression as well, right? C, but thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, they do not have anywhere to confide to, right? Because societal systems are not reachable, right? At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, they're like that's deep, right? At the end of the day, when a woman is suffering from all these sorts of problems that like inherently stop her from accessing facilities that would have allowed her to undergo abortion, right? But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, just because you want to make an example out of it, or just because you want to hold an accessory liability, holding that person who is already a victim further criminally liable, and you're ruining the future of that child who needed that parent the most, right? At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we believe these are things that are inherently unacceptable, and that are things that we shouldn't do, right? So, like moving on to what this does, right? This taglines this parent as a person who had malicious intent, right? Even if they did not, right? So a parent who like so at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, what this does is this also hurdles further parent-child bonding, right? How does it do so? Because at this point in time, parents who are callous, right? Parents who wouldn't have cared about their children in the future as well, right? Now they're forced to care about their children just because the government forces to do so, right? At the end of the day, this prevents that bonding which would have existed in other cases, right? For instance, if you did not care about that fetus, but when that child came up, right, you realize that he's a part of you, he looks like you, and you actually want to take care of him, right? You can empathize with him because he has a disability, right? At the end of the day, the parent could have taken care of him, right? But at this point in time, when you actually force him to undergo that severe stress that he's like to overlook that severe stress that he's already been through, right? To overlook that victim card, right? That he has been a rape victim, or to overlook the fact that he did not have that parent, that she did not have access to social facilities to undergo abortion. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, you actually want that person to still not like live her life, or to still not drink or like smoke or do whatever it takes for her to actually like be herself, right? At the end of the day, you're forcing her to to overlook a part of herself that could have helped her that could have helped her rehabilitate out of that situation. What that does is this makes that parent even more like even more unlikely to care for that child, right? And this harms the future development of that child. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, this inherently like destroys this inherently destroy the very pure idea of parenthood and whatnot, right? So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, this like ruins the family as a whole. But so what have I shown you? Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, when is a person considered a moral entity, right? We've continuously told you that a person is only considered a moral entity when it has feelings, when it can understand pain, when it can like when whatever is done to it, right, is affecting it in
9
some way.
minutes.
So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, they had no response to that. Secondly, we tell you how do you help people who actually need this help? How do you help people who are rape victims or abusers? Right? They have no response to that. So like thirdly, we talk about the after effects, and they actually worsen the status quo, right? So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we're very proud to oppose this motion is counterproductive, like option one. Thank you.
Here.
Okay, guys.
Isn't Abrar edging?
Yeah, he is.
I can't without Sarah, can I?
Huh?
Can I edge without Sarah? Like,
Abrar's edging. Why you go here when opposition gives a speech? Biased edge. Biased edge.
debate
I go here after every speech. Anyways,
Bullshit.
listen.
I only heard it once.
Since
here বলতেছো like speech এর পরে এবার বলো না দেখে আমি বলছি
Acha, wait, let me just stop the broadcast.
আমি ঘুমাইতে গেলাম